Hi, welcome to my next episode. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about my journey in learning to forgive myself. This podcast is a space for me to muse about my journey in learning to laugh and love and live after leaving fundamentalism. I was a pastor in the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement for 10 years. And in 2019, after questioning and doubting and deconstructing, reconstructing, studying, tearing it all to pieces, my wife and I walked away from the church, from the ministry, from Christianity altogether. Since then, I have been learning to heal, and part of my healing process has been learning to forgive myself. Not only healing from the religious trauma that I experienced in the very high controlling and toxic environment of the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, but also learning to forgive myself for the trauma that I caused. I was a pastor for 10 years. I was a youth pastor for 2 to 3 years. I worked under youth pastors, and I was also children's ministry leader for several years while in that environment. And over the course of those years, there was a lot of trauma that I caused, a lot of religious trauma that I caused to people who I was over, who I interacted with. Part of my journey in healing and learning to forgive myself has been telling my story. And if you are struggling with any sort of negative emotion that you want to process through and navigate through, sometimes part of the healing process is just telling your story, finding somebody that can hold space for you as you tell your story. And I've worked with people over the years that have been able to hold space for me, and I've gotten to the point to where I feel stronger and more confident and safe enough, brave enough to share parts of my story publicly, in hopes that while I am healing, it will maybe help pave the way for others to heal as well. So, leaving Independent Fundamental Baptist, it's a cult. Processing what happened to me throughout all of that, trying to just figure out what in the world what happened to me, I began to carry the shame and the weight and the guilt and even anger towards myself for the damage that I caused while being a leader and being a pastor in that movement. And part of that process of healing was convincing myself that it's okay to feel shame, it's okay to feel guilt, and it's okay to feel anger. It's okay to feel. For so long, we're taught that you ought to always be joyful. Don't be angry. Be angry and sin not. Don't go to bed angry. Anger is a sinful emotion. But I've had to convince myself that that's a false and destructive narrative. All feeling and all emotion is good and it's healthy. It's a way for us to, it's almost like a check engine light on the dashboard of your vehicle, that when that light comes on, when you're feeling an emotion, especially negative emotion, or what you would call a negative emotion, low vibrational emotion, it's like a check engine light that comes on in your dashboard, letting you know that something in your vehicle is not right. And so when you're feeling that, it's letting you know that there's something going on that needs some attention. And so, in learning to forgive myself, beginning that journey, I've convinced myself that it is okay to feel something other than being happy, good vibes only, joy. It's okay to just sit and be angry, to be pissed off. Not only pissed off at what happened to me when I was in that cult environment, but pissed off at myself for the things that I did when I was in that environment. It's okay to feel guilty. Guilt is an indication that you may not have done something right. You may have done something that was a little damaging to yourself or to someone else. And of course, the shame as well. It's okay to feel that. And so when I got to the point to where I began to believe that it was okay to feel guilty and to feel shame and to feel angry, it made it easier for me to then sit with those emotions. And I want to encourage you, when you're feeling those emotions, especially when you are processing the trauma that happened to you, and in my case, the trauma that I caused, it's good to sit with the emotion. It's almost like emotions are loops that need to be closed. When something is painful, when something causes trauma, when something hurts you, and you react to it with an emotion or a feeling, it's almost like it's a loop that begins, that opens. It's almost like a buffering, you know what I'm saying? And it needs to work its way through and eventually process and come to a close and empower you to then move on or cope with it or deal with it. So what happens is that when trauma happens, something negative happens to you, and that you set a emotion loop, set that emotion loop in motion. If you don't sit with it long enough and you're like, no, I shouldn't feel this way, I shouldn't feel guilty, I shouldn't feel shame, I shouldn't feel angry, and you shove that aside, it is a open loop. It is an unclosed loop. It goes with mourning as well. If you've lost a loved one, and I've had to go through that as well. I've lost a lot of loved ones in my life, and especially if you've in a position where you feel like you have to be a rock and you have to be strong for everyone else in that situation, I can't mourn right now. I can't feel this way right now, and you just shove it back into your proverbial closet, your psychological closet, and it sits there and it festers, and it and every once in a while it might pop back up. It's kind of like too when children are growing up in a household that maybe they're not given space to express emotions. They're not given space to cry. Maybe it's a toxic masculinity type environment where boys aren't supposed to cry, just dry it up and move on. And when you are not allowed to allow that emotion to work, just finish, you shove it aside. And that's why maybe at later times children might overreact, what you would consider overreact about something. Well, don't cry over spilt milk. Well, more often than not, that child is not crying over spilt milk. It's actually closing a loop that they were forced to set aside a long time ago, and spilling their milk was maybe a trigger that drug an unclosed emotion or an unclosed feeling out and began that loop closing process again. And I think too, as you're going through life and those emotions pop up, and maybe in your awareness, you're like, man, why did I react that way? I feel like I overreacted. Well, sit with that emotion for a minute, because there's a good chance that the emotion that you're feeling in that moment, that thing that you're feeling in that moment, is not necessarily a reaction to what just happened to you per se, but what just happened to you may be a trigger that drug out an emotion that you were not given space to close when something traumatic happened. And so now a trigger that maybe is somehow connected or reminds you of that thing that happened to you a long time ago, you drag that emotion back out and begin that trauma loop again. And so when I think about when there's a trigger, or when I think about some of the things that I did in the past as an independent fundamental Baptist pastor, and the emotions begin to arise, I give myself permission and say, you know what, it's okay to feel this. Give myself permission to feel it, and give myself permission to sit with it as long as I can. And that's my next point. Sit with it as long as you can. It's almost like you're sitting in a pot of water and there's a fire under it, and it gets hotter and hotter, and you're able to sit with it for a long time until it gets too hot and you got to jump out. But then the next time you get in, you might be able to sit in longer. It's almost like, stretching. You're stretching yourself, lifting weights maybe. You can lift 150, and you're just stretching yourself. And the next time you're able to bump it up to 160, 170. You can probably tell I don't lift weights often because I'm probably not using the illustration properly. But you get the point. You're stretching yourself. And so when you sit with that emotion and it becomes overwhelming, sit with it as long as you can until you just can't anymore, and then maybe you do need to just set it aside. But you stretched yourself and you allowed that loop to get closer and closer to closing, and then the next time you're able to pull it out, you feel safe enough to pull it out, or maybe again you're triggered and you're forced to pull it out. Try to sit with it a little bit longer. But man, you got to start with giving yourself permission to feel. And give yourself permission to feel it as long as you need to. Oh, I shouldn't feel angry. I got to show this side. I shouldn't feel this way. No, stop. Give yourself permission to feel, and give yourself permission to feel as long as you need to and as long as you can. Because the more you stretch yourself and sit with those emotions, the easier and easier it is to handle. There's an illustration, I don't know quite the application, but an illustration that came up in a conversation that I overheard earlier this week. This concept, or this idea about emotions or feelings are all siblings in the same family. And if you want peace and you want joy, then you have to learn to sit with the grief and the pain, the anger, the frustration, the guilt, and the shame. You think about if you have a family come over, and, I think about growing up as a kid, and there were some large families, especially in the independent fundamental Baptist movement and the homeschool movement. They got a lot of big families. So we had some families that had 5, 6, 7, 8 kids that would come over, even more, and you'd hang out with them. And especially in a family that size, there's always one of the kids, one or two of the kids that are just awkward and weird, and that you see as awkward and weird, and you just can't stand to be around them. But you've got a few others that you love playing with and you enjoy, but there's a few others in the family that you just can't. Well, guess what? They're a package deal. And if you want to play with the ones that you enjoy, you have to learn to get along with the ones you don't, because if you kick them out of your house, the entire family goes. And so I've learned that if I want to enjoy peace, and I want to enjoy joy and comfort and strength and courage, I have to learn to live with, I have to learn to get along with its brothers and sisters: shame, grief, guilt, and anger. And the more I've learned to get along with them, the more that I've learned to tolerate them and allow them into my space, seems like the byproduct of that has been joy and peace and strength. It's almost like you really can't have one without the other. That's just how I feel. And if I try so hard to kick the ones out, it's almost like the whole family goes, you know? So this concept of seeing emotions as children of the same family, sometimes in certain situations and scenarios, in order to process it, you can't have one without the other. So you have to learn to get along with the feelings that you're not crazy about in order to be in the presence of those that you really want there. Also, sometimes too, learning to separate myself from those emotions, because I am not anger, I am not guilt, I am not shame. Those are just emotions that I'm observing. So as I'm sitting there, giving myself permission to observe them, separating myself from them, they're not me, they're not my identity. Yeah, they're a part of me, but I just sit there and I just observe them, and I give myself permission to observe them, be with them, feel them, emote them, as long as I need to, as long as I can, but sit there as an observer of those things and just allow myself, allow them to play out. So in learning to forgive myself, again, just giving myself permission to feel, giving myself permission to feel as long as I want, as long as I need, as long as I can. But then also realizing that I was brainwashed. I'm going to share with you a couple of things that I did. Again, learning to forgive myself, part of healing is sharing my story. So I'm gonna be open and vulnerable a little bit here, a little more open and more vulnerable here, and share my story. A couple of stories. Oh boy. When I was in college, Independent Fundamental Baptist College, Bible College, I spent a summer traveling with some preacher boys, evangelists, going around to different churches, ranging from Tennessee, Georgia, on up to New York. I think we even did one over in Wisconsin, Indiana, just all over that area. And we would come into a church on a Saturday, Friday night, on a Saturday. It was a Saturday afternoon, evening. And we would help the church host a vacation Bible school. And if you have been in this space before or are in this space now, you know that you know all about Vacation Bible School. And this was just a big push to get kids to come to church. Kids who are unchurched, kids who are from families who are unchurched. And one of the things too that we've always, we're always taught that you've got to get them when they're young. You've got to get them when they're young, because if they get to a certain age, they're harder and harder to, well, now on the outside looking back, if you get them past a certain age, they're harder and harder to brainwash. But when you're in it, they're harder and harder to convince of the truth, So if you can get them early. So we would put on these vacation Bible schools from ages, preschool, 3-4 years old on up to elementary school. In some churches we would do, teenagers and whatnot. But we would, it would be a week-long thing, and kids would come to the church for a few hours, and you'd have games, you'd have activities and songs and fun stuff, and then you'd have the time of crafts and telling stories, and then you'd have a sermon time where you would just lay it on as heavily as you could in an effort to get kids to come forward and say this magical sinner's prayer to invite Jesus into their life and become saved, become part of the club, and secure their place in heaven someday. So, being an independent fundamental Baptist, I was brainwashed to believe, and I firmly believed at the time, that if these kids did not say the sinner's prayer and they were to die having never said the sinner's prayer, they would spend eternity in hell, an eternal, fiery torture chamber where they would be tortured for the rest of their lives or for the rest of eternity if they didn't say this prayer before they died. And I was convinced of that. I mean, it was my truth that I was living, and so there was a desperation and a sense of urgency that we had to do everything necessary to get these kids to convert. And so it was a Friday night, and at the end of the week, we would always have this big rally, and that was usually the most attended. And it was just one final push to get these kids to say that prayer. And it was my turn. We would take turns. The preacher boys would rotate. We would take turns hosting that big rally at the end of the week. And it was my turn. And I felt that this was my last night. This is my last opportunity to get these kids to convert. And if and I was afraid that if I didn't do all that I could, I would live with the guilt and the shame, and their blood was going to be on my hands. If they were to slip off into eternity, having never said that prayer, and they were to go to hell, if I didn't do everything I possibly could to save them, to get them saved, their blood would be on my hands. And so out of that desperation and sense of urgency, we would always push the envelope. So it was my turn to lead the rally that night, and I thought, you know what? I am going to crank up the fear factor. That's one of our tactics. As independent fundamental Baptists, one of our major, biggest tactic is fear factor. Man, if I want to get you to do something, or if I feel like you need to be motivated to do something, or you ought to be doing something that I feel you ought to be doing, my most successful tactic was fear. If I can get you lost and on your way to hell, that's the only way I can get you to convert. If I can convince you, there's an angry God, that's the only way I can get you. That's the only way I can convert you. To get your tithes and monies and offerings, if you don't give to the church, the transmission's going to fall out of your car, your house is going to burn down, and you're going to get sick because God is going to get his money some way, somehow. It's fear tactics, man. It's all fear. So, as I'm getting ready to lead this rally, I'm going to crank up the fear factor, and so. Oh, jeez. This was the summer that was just a couple months after, or right around the same time that the Columbine shooting had taken place. And any one of us that knows about that and was alive when that happened, or was aware of what happened, as any other school shooting, many young people were hurt, affected, and lives were taken. And so as I'm standing there in front of these kids, in a group of kids ages 3 or 4 on up to 12 or 13, I thought, I'm going to use that story because it's so fresh in the minds of kids. At that point, kids are afraid to go to school, nervous about going to school. What if one of my classmates ends up being that kind of a person that would do that? And so I decided I was going to use that to tug at their heartstrings, to play with their emotions and their fears, to get as many kids as possible to convert. So I said something along the lines of, how many of you are familiar with the Columbine situation that took place? What were to happen if you were to go to school on Monday and one of your classmates pulled a gun out of their bag and began to shoot everyone. And what were to happen if you were to get hit and you were to die, not ever having accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? Where would you spend eternity? None of those kids knew, and this is what I'm telling them, none of those kids knew the day that they would go to school, that day was going to be their last day on this earth. And what were to happen if you went to school Monday and that were to happen to you, and that was your last day on this earth? And I'm saying this, man, to kids ages 3 and 4 years on up to 12, 13. Sweet, precious, beautiful little babies, little children. I don't remember what the response was. I don't remember how many kids I converted that day. But looking back, I can't believe that I was so brainwashed into thinking that what I said and what I did that day was okay. That was probably the biggest thing I've had to learn to forgive myself over. That and painting a gory and gruesome picture of hell to these little babies, ages 3 and 4 on up to 12, 13, and then even on into being a youth pastor. I'd stand in front of these little kids and I'd paint this gory picture of hell. It's the place where the worm dieth not, and you're going to have worms crawling in and out of your sockets, and you're going to be feeling this intense pain. How many of you have ever been burned before? Maybe you accidentally got too close to the fire or touched a stove that was hot. You have raised, kids raise your hand. You remember how that felt? It felt bad, didn't it? Well, imagine that pain all over your body forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. That's what you're gonna experience if you don't ask Jesus Christ to come into your life and save you. And I am using this tactic on precious little children. It's taken me a long time to forgive myself, or to begin to forgive myself for that. When I was a youth pastor, and I would have young teenage girls come into the class, and they would be wearing, of course, as a fundamentalist, pants is evil and sinful, but not just pants that were tight, or maybe shorts that were way too short, or skirts that were way too short, or shirts that were way too low cut. And I would shame them and belittle them from the pulpit, calling them mean, nasty, horrible names. It has taken me a long time to even begin to forgive myself. I was brainwashed. My belief and my behavior had been manipulated. I didn't know any better. It's not like I was malicious, and thinking, I know I'm damaging these children, but I need to get another notch on my salvation belt. So when I go back to college, I can report to my professors and my pastors. I can report to them on the dozens or hundreds of kids that got saved during this campaign. I remember feeling so desperate and a sense of urgency, and I justified those things because I felt I needed to do whatever it took to keep these kids from spending eternity in hell. And that's how I justified it. And I didn't know any better. And even if subconsciously I knew better, I felt that in that moment, I felt that the temporal pain I might be causing these kids on a psychological level is far outweighed by the physical and spiritual pain these kids would have to endure for all eternity if I couldn't get them saved. Even now, sharing this story with you, I feel a little lighter. I feel a little better, you know. And again, if you are carrying the weight of guilt and shame and anger, and part of your healing journey and part of your healing process is learning to forgive yourself, find a space where you can tell your story. Convince yourself, give yourself permission that it is okay to feel shame and to feel guilt and to feel anger. And it's okay to sit and observe these emotions and sit with them as long as you want to. Sit with them as long as you need to, and sit with them as long as you can stand it. Because you are stretching yourself and you are making it easier and easier and easier to carry the weight of those emotions until they have finally been given enough space to close, to process. Knowing that all of the emotions in this particular scenario, the peace and the joy and the forgiveness that I eventually would like to feel, are the siblings of the emotions that I am feeling right now. And it's the family. And if I want these, I need to figure out a way to tolerate and get along with these. And then again, understanding that I was brainwashed, my belief and my behavior had been manipulated. I didn't know any better. And then I guess the last thing I would share with you is just give yourself time to heal. Let time heal. Maybe it may not be completely healed per se. There may always be, and healing isn't necessarily a destination. It's always going to be a journey. And perhaps maybe for me, the damage that was done, the damage that was done to me, what I'm feeling, it may still be a part of me for the rest of my existence, but maybe I want to get it to the point to where it is not a scab, but maybe a scar. You know what I mean? Go from the wide open, gaping, gushing, bloody wound to a scab that gets picked every once in a while, but eventually gets to the point to where the process of healing, it's a scar. You know, it's still there. I can still feel it, but it is not this overwhelming pain that it once was when it was wide open and just gushing and pouring out. So just let time do its thing, man. Just let time do its thing. So I guess I want to close with these thoughts. I hope somehow that if there is a God or there is some force at work in the universe, that source, that love, that light, that consciousness, that something will somehow allow those that I have hurt to cross my path again, and maybe even through this video. And so I'm hoping that maybe some of those that I've interacted with over the years are watching right now. If I can't, or I'm unable to see you face to face, I've lost lost contact with so many people over the years, But I want to tell you, if I hurt you, I'm very, very sorry. And if you have been hurt by any pastor or leader in the independent fundamental Baptist movement or any denomination, any high control, toxic cult religion that you've come out of or are on your way out of or even are still in the middle of, I hope that maybe some of these thoughts will give you a little bit of solace, a little bit of make it just a little bit better. But let me tell you this. For those that I hurt and for those that have been hurt, you came into this world perfect. You are perfect. You are whole. You are complete. You are not broken, needing fixed. You are not dirty, needing clean. You are not sinful, needing to be made righteous. You are not lost, needing to be found. You are not struggling and suffering, needing a savior. You are perfect and beautiful, just the way you are. And you are worthy of all that is good. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of being loved. You are loved. You are lovable. And I hope that somehow, some way, that helps. When we get messed up like that, our nervous system just gets so far out of whack and it needs to be regulated. And sometimes that regulation is some of the things that I've shared with you helps regulate that nervous system. Sometimes a good hug will just help regulate that nervous system. Sometimes changing the narrative helps regulate the nervous system, paves the way, opens and gives space for that nervous system to re-regulate and get back on track. But I hope that somehow, some way, what I've shared with you helps. Thank you so much for stopping by. Thank you so much for giving me space to share what I want to share with you today. And to keep it real, you may have heard my dryer buzzing in the background. You might hear a train. There's a train coming. I live a block away, and I've got a mechanic shop on the cross the road that just loves to rev the engine. So if you've heard some of those noises, I do apologize. Just keeping it raw, keeping it real. But I hope that what I've shared with you today has somehow, some way, been a help to you. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope to talk to you again soon.